August 23, 2023. Cape Turcankut, the westernmost point of occupied Crimea. A single Ukrainian Neptune cruise missile, built as an anti-ship weapon and modified for a target it was never designed to hit, closes on a Russian S-400 Triumf battery that has stood on this stretch of coastline for years. Beside it sits a Pantsir short-range system, fielded specifically to catch anything the S-400's own radar misses. The missile hits. Neither system fires on it. Ukraine's then National Security and Defense Council Secretary Alexei Danilov calls the strike's performance flawless. A Ukrainian official's own assessment, not an independently adjudicated damage report. Russia has roughly 5 of these batteries ringing Crimea, each valued in the hundreds of millions of dollars by open-source estimates. One has just gone dark. The next 3 weeks answer that question. Was that a lucky shot? Or had Ukraine found the seam in a shield priced near $400 million a battery? The S-400 Triumf is Russia's premier long-range air defense system, built by Almazante and marketed as the answer to almost anything that flies: aircraft, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, tracked and engaged inside one integrated network. It entered Russian service in 2007, and Moscow has sold it since as the flagship of its air defense export catalog, fielded at home and by export customers including India, China, and Turkey. A battery typically operates 2 kinds of radar. An engagement radar, NATO nicknamed it Gravestone, locks weapons onto a target once one is found. A longer-range search radar, NATO nicknamed it Cheeseboard, scans further out to find one in the first place. Neither is cheap, and neither is quick to replace, and that second fact matters more here than it sounds. In Crimea, the system does 2 jobs at once. It shields the Black Sea Fleet's home port at Sevastopol, and it screens the approach to the Kerch Strait Bridge, the single road and rail link tying the peninsula to Russia. For the first year and a half of the war, that coverage was the reason Russian commanders treated Crimea as the safest rear area available to them, a place to base aircraft, store ammunition, and repair ships largely free of Ukrainian long-range fire. A quick aside before the mechanism: if this kind of sourced mechanism first breakdown of the drone and missile war is useful, subscribing is what puts more of it in front of you. Back to Crimea. The missile that changed that calculus has an unlikely history. Neptune was developed through the 2010s by Ukraine's state-run Luch Design Bureau and entered service only shortly before the full-scale invasion. A subsonic anti-ship weapon powered by a Motorsich MS-400 turbofan. Ukraine says its first combat use came in April 2022, when a pair of Neptunes sank the cruiser Moskva, the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet, in the war's opening weeks. Russia has never acknowledged a missile strike, attributing the loss instead to an onboard fire and ammunition explosion, so treat the sinking's cause as Ukraine's account, widely credited by Western officials, rather than a settled fact. The land attack version fired at Tarkankut 16 months later is a modification of that same airframe, reported by Ukrainian officials at a range near 400 kilometers, about 250 miles, with a warhead around 350 kilograms. The stakes sit in one comparison: a battery of S-400 hardware, priced by open-source estimates somewhere between $300 and $500 million, against a missile adapted from a program built to sink ships, aimed at a target class its designers never planned for. Start with what the S-400's radar is built to see. Its whole design assumption is a target with altitude, an aircraft cruising at several thousand meters, a ballistic missile arcing in from space. Against that kind of target, Gravestone and Cheeseboard have a wide standoff view, tracking contacts well over 100 kilometers out. Against a missile hugging the terrain at treetop height, the same radars run into a hard physical limit that has nothing to do with Russian engineering. It is called the radar horizon, and every ground-based radar on the planet shares it. The limit is basic geometry, the same reason a hot air balloon is visible from a hilltop miles away while a car dips out of sight the moment it drops behind a ridge. A radar mast that reaches a target at altitude across 100 kilometers or more can lose the same signal to Earth curvature and terrain masking within a few kilometers once that target drops to treetop height. The target hasn't gotten smaller. It has gotten harder to see in a straight line, and a straight line is all a radar has. Follow the engagement chain a defender has to complete, detect a contact, classify it as a threat, assign a weapon, fire, then guide that weapon to intercept, all before impact. Every step in that chain costs real seconds. A human operator has to confirm a track. A system has to slew an interceptor onto a bearing, and none of it is instantaneous even on the fastest air defense network built. Against an aircraft at altitude, the radar horizon buys minutes to work through that chain. Plenty of room for every step to happen in order. Against a missile skimming the ground, the same chain has to run inside whatever sliver of time the horizon leaves once it finally clears, and that sliver runs to a matter of seconds, not the minutes a controller needs. Flying low is only half the design. Consistent with the design logic of the wider Neptune family, the land attack variant stays low and limits what it hands a defender to detect at all. Well short of the signature, a radar warning receiver would flag on an actively transmitting target. That general approach, terrain-hugging flight paired with a quiet electronic signature, is the same family Western missiles like Storm Shadow belong to. Storm Shadow flies as low as 30 to 40 meters using a terrain-referenced guidance system called TERPROM. Neptune's own terminal guidance isn't detailed to that level in open sources, so treat the mechanism as shared design logic across this weapon class, not a confirmed one-to-one match. A cruise missile's warhead does its damage the way a blast fragmentation charge does. It detonates close enough to shred an antenna array or shatter the electronics and hydraulics packed inside a launch vehicle's hull without needing to level the vehicle itself. The target doesn't need to be flattened to be useless. It needs its sensors and wiring destroyed, and a spray of fragmentation at close range does that as reliably as a much larger blast would. That is the gap the Pantsir exists to close, and also where the design depends on something outside its own control. Russia pairs S-400 batteries with Pantsir gun missile systems, a combination of 30mm cannons and short-range interceptor missiles, specifically to catch anything that slips past the long-range radar. But a Pantsir's own onboard radar is a smaller vehicle-mounted set built for a much shorter reach than the S-400's fixed installation, so in practice it depends on a handoff, either from its own sensor picking up a close contact or from the parent network cueing it in. If the parent radar never registers a track, there is nothing to hand off and the point defense layer sits idle, waiting on a cue that never comes. At Turkankut, the missile hits. The radar never breaks silence, and the Pantsir never fires. The available evidence, no intercept attempt from either system, is consistent with a radar that never got a track on the missile at all, though no side has released the kind of internal telemetry that would confirm exactly what either radar saw. Within seconds, a battery that had stood on that coastline for years goes dark. Not a shot that got lucky, but a seam in the design that any low-flying cruise missile from any direction would eventually find. A $400 million battery, gone in seconds to a missile built to sink ships. 3 weeks later, Ukraine tests whether that was repeatable. On September 14, 2023, Ukraine came back for a second battery at Yevpatoria, roughly 60 kilometers south along the same coastline. This time, the sequence, according to Ukrainian Security Service and Navy statements, ran in 2 phases. First, kamikaze drones hit the site's radar and antenna array directly, blinding its fire control before a single missile was airborne. Then Ukraine's Navy fired 2 more Neptune missiles into the exposed launch complex. Among the wreckage, open-source analysts identified a destroyed transporter erector launcher. one of the vehicles that physically carries and fires the S-400's missiles. That drone then missile choreography is a Ukrainian-sourced account, not independently adjudicated by any Western government. Though the underlying event, a second Crimean S-400 site knocked out inside a month, is corroborated across multiple outlets and satellite imagery. Russia had 5 S-400 batteries defending Crimea when this campaign opened. Within 3 weeks, 2 were gone, hit by variants of the same missile type. That is a pattern, and Moscow's own response over the following years treats it as one. Not every strike on Russian air defense in Crimea since has repeated this exact playbook. 9 months later, on May 13, 2024, a storm shadow struck a long-range early warning radar station on Ai-Petri Mountain. 2 days after that, an American ATAMS, a ballistic missile rather than a cruise missile, hit Belbek Air Base directly, destroying another gravestone engagement radar and reportedly damaging 2 further S-400 or S-300 systems on the ground. The weapon changed. The target class and the choice to aim at the radar rather than the launcher held. Aiming at the radar rather than the launcher buys more per strike. A launcher is a truck with missiles on it, expensive, but replaceable off an existing production line. A radar like Gravestone is a different problem. The defense analysis site 1945 reports domestic pricing near $30 million a unit and export configured versions running as high as 60, with a broader early warning radar in the Nebo M family topping $100 million on its own. Russia can rebuild a damaged launch vehicle faster than it can rebuild the sensor that tells that vehicle where to shoot. This does not point to incompetence on the Russian side. Pulling every coastal battery further inland would trade away the detection range the S-400 is deployed to provide in the first place, so the crews manning these sites were working the geometry they were handed, under standing orders that assumed the main threat would arrive from altitude. The pattern kept exposing the same defender's dilemma: stay forward and stay exposed to a weapon built to exploit the radar horizon, or pull back and give up the coverage the system exists to deliver. The strain shows up in numbers beyond Crimea, too. Reported delivery delays on Russia's own S-400 export contracts, including to India, point to a production base already stretched by peacetime orders, before combat losses enter the picture at all. Independent researchers at Oryx have visually confirmed further Russian S-400 radar and launcher losses on multiple separate occasions since 2023. A running list that only ever grows as analysts geolocate new imagery. The pattern kept repeating well past 2023, and it stopped being only a cruise missile story. On February 25, 2026, a Ukrainian special operations strike destroyed an S-400 launcher and a Gravestone series radar in a single engagement, per Ukrainian Special Forces statements. Overnight on August 8 and 9, 2026, a strike near Gelendzhik, on Russia's own Black Sea coast beyond Crimea, destroyed another launcher, per Ukraine's unmanned systems forces. Days later, naval drone units from Ukraine's Group 13 hit 2 further launchers and a drone control antenna at a separate battery back in Crimea. That later cluster is reported by GUR and unmanned systems forces statements, corroborated by independent press on the fact of the strikes, though the exact damage tally is unconfirmed. Different platforms every time, drones instead of missiles, the same target class Tarkankut identified 3 years earlier. An air defense network rebuilds only as fast as its slowest part, and that part is the radar. Russia can keep building S-400 launch vehicles on an existing line. It has struggled to keep building Gravestone and cheeseboard radars fast enough even for paying export customers. And every strike that destroys one buys the attacker months of a blind seam in exactly the place it happened before, whatever weapon finds it next. The exposure does not stop at Crimea. India, China, and Turkey have all bought or discussed buying the same S-400 family, on the same design assumptions about altitude and radar coverage that failed at Tarkankut. None of those customers face Ukraine's specific missiles, and geography and doctrine differ by buyer, so nothing here says any of their batteries would fall the same way. What travels with the hardware, regardless of who operates it, is the underlying physics. A ground-based radar's blind spot against anything skimming the terrain is a property of the system, not of the country flying it. Any state fielding this family inherits the same seam, tested or not. 3 things carry forward from this campaign. A price tag tells you what a system costs to build, not what it costs to beat. Altitude decides more of an engagement than the missile count on either side. And that gap doesn't close by adding more launchers to a network with the same blind spot. And this was never a one-time trick. The same weakness carried a single missile in 2023 through a ballistic strike in 2024 to a fleet of naval drones 3 years after that. None of this makes Russia's air defense worthless. The S-400 network still intercepts plenty of what's thrown at it, and Crimea today is not undefended. What changed is narrower. The assumption that a $400 million battery buys certainty against everything that flies. It buys a battery with a known geometry problem instead, and a determined enough adversary only has to find that seam once to prove it real, then keep finding it for years to prove it was never luck. The missile that started this campaign had already made history once before it ever flew inland, on the night Ukraine says it sent Russia's own flagship to the bottom of the Black Sea. That story is next.